Let's kick things off with some introductions. My name is Melissa, and I work here at Prevalent in business development. And today we welcome back CEO at Voodoo Security and SAN Senior Instructor Dave Shackleford. Great to see you again. And
great to be here.
Yeah,
I don't unmute myself.
Unmute. Sorry, I didn't tell you I was going to call on you right at the beginning. And we also have Scott Lang. He's with us. He's our VP of Product Marketing, and he will dive into how we may be able to help mature your TPRM program at the end of this session. So hello, Scott.
Hey, Melissa.
And today, Dave will be discussing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 and the implications for your TPRM program. As a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded, as you can see, so you'll get this and the slideshow shortly after the webinar. You're all muted, as you can see that as well, so just use that Q&A box for those burning questions. And without further ado, I will let Dave get started. Go ahead.
Awesome, thanks. And hey, thanks everybody for being here. I mean, who doesn't love some, hot security framework chat on a Wednesday, right? Look, this is one of those where, I think truthfully, having spent a lot of time dealing with people's risk management programs and looking at frameworks and, sometimes checking boxes for compliance, sometimes not checking boxes for compliance. Over the years, what we've seen is, an effort, even if this is not, holistically the exact standard that you're looking to adhere to across your organization for all things security. It's nice to have frameworks like this that are pretty flexible, relatively straightforward in their categorical breakdown, and that cover sort of the big pieces of what anybody's security program should cover, coming from some smart folks like NIST. What's not to love about it? So yeah, hey, you might still be dealing with PCI or dealing with things like HIPAA or any of the variety of different financial frameworks and different regulations. But having that NIST CSF in the background has really been a boon for a lot of different security organizations out there. And it sort of presents this nice taxonomy that we can sort of break down and use again, even if it's just to do some sort of counter evaluation of some of the other things that we've been doing. So of course, why you're all probably gathered here and hanging out today is, we got a new update that's coming on the way. And there's a lot of implications and things that come along with major updates to frameworks. So again, whether regulatory or just industry standard wise, and especially for one that's as heavily used as this one, we're all kind of sitting up and paying attention. And here's the thing to note as we just dive into things right here at the beginning. This is not wholly finalized yet. So just want to make that clear so that you don't walk away from today going, okay, this is the hard and fast, exactly what's going to be coming out of this. There is absolutely still some room for this to change as we get into it over the course of the next, probably 6 months or so. And so I'll sort of give some breakdown on that here in just a minute. But what I want to do is specifically, of course, because this webinar is really emphasizing third-party risk, what that looks like within the framework, but also sort of what's driving a lot of this. I think this might be, as anybody that's ever heard me do a presentation before, I like to start off with my classic Captain Obvious slide. So this is that. Here's that classic Captain Obvious slide that I think we're all fully aware of today. I think that the nature of interconnectedness and the nature of the business ecosystem that we're all, to some degree a part of, it sort of necessitates paying attention to third-party risk no matter what. But we've really had to pay more attention to this in recent years because it's becoming a really big problem. It's not as though third-party risk just manifested on the face of the planet 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, this has been going on for decades and decades, but it really felt like, I don't know, maybe somewhere around the, late 2000-ish timeframe, let's call it like 2010. This started accelerating a bit, right? You started to see these, third-party or even fourth-party scenario where someone was compromised. Because they were compromised, others were compromised. And again, that trickle-down effect has really manifested today, so much so that I honestly expect just about every breach notification that we get or any of the announcements of breaches to partially include or maybe fully include something related to third-party risk. And again, I know I'm not alone in feeling that way. It's just become that prevalent and common out in the industry. And so it's like, all right, look, we got to start taking stock of third-party vendors. We got to start having better conversations with, our procurement teams. We need to understand contracts, especially for those of you that are in big organizations, big distributed organizations. that have maybe completely autonomous business units. So, hey, it's this geographic territory, or this completely distinct business. Maybe some of you have grown through acquisition and mergers and things where you sort of assimilate all the different pieces and parts that come with that that new company or that new partner into the fold. And there's just, I hate to say it this way, there's just so many ways that this can go terribly, horribly wrong. And unfortunately, it is happening all around us. If you go look at some of the most recent different reports. I always like to point at things like the Verizon data breach investigations report, because it's sort of eponymous, right? Everybody's familiar with it, or at least most folks are familiar with it. They're good at what they do. This is really a great group of folks that's very objective. They try not to let their own biases get in the way. They're very impartial about the way that they treat that data. And consistently over the past several years, this has been a major theme. And many of the sort of case by case scenarios that that they have to evaluate or that they're bringing in as part of that data set. And so all signs, I guess, maybe to sum up my classic Captain Obvious slide, are pointing to a bigger need in just about every organization out there to start addressing this, perhaps more differently than we have in the past. So this is sort of the beginning of it all. Obviously, we've got expanding risk profiles that compound the problem, right? Especially for, again, bigger organizations. I've got some clients that have, hundreds and hundreds of third parties. I've actually got one client with more than 1,000, just thinking off the top of my head, that they don't know everything about those third parties, right? There's definitely gaps. There's just areas where there are too many, unknown unknowns. And that's giving people, sort of the bad vibe that we could be, potentially exposed here. We could be potentially compromised. We could be caught up in data exposure, data breaches, even full-blown compromise situations. If you've got, say, remote connectivity for certain types of vendors or partners within your organization. And I'll give you a good example of this, right? Just because we're sort of setting the stage for why this is getting so much more discussion out in the industry. I do work with, let's call it mid-sized organizations very frequently. And I'm not talking about, 3 people. I'm talking about, 10,000 employees or something, right? It's not a small organization by any means, but might be running a fairly lean security organization. And over the past several years, a lot of those kinds of companies, a lot of those kinds of organizations have really started to just throw their hands up and say, look, with current staffing, current budgeting, we are absolutely not going to be able to juggle all the different types of security operations requirements that we have. And as such, naturally, the vendor community has risen up, the service provider community has risen up to address that and to offer new solutions and capabilities in the form of things like managed detection and response. The whole nature of managed security service providers, or MSSPs, has shifted and changed to encompass a lot more capabilities than we used to have. And what that means, though, is that you've got, ostensibly somebody that's not only, gaining access into your environment, but doing so with extraordinarily high levels of privilege. And they can see a lot and do a lot as a part of their expected job function. And so it's like, okay, look, as just one example, that's huge. That's a huge business segment now. And I look at some of the scenarios we've watched unfold over recent years and think, hey, what happens if they get popped, right? We've seen things like SolarWinds. We've seen some of these other case scenarios that, we've sort of had to take a step back and go, okay, are we even in a good position to address the third-party risks that we may have? Do we even feel like we have a good grasp on that? Do we have the ability to monitor for what's going on? And again, I'll take the example I just gave, looking at things like these MDR services and MSSP type capabilities and services, and saying, okay, I probably know what they look like, right? Where their main point of ingress is, perhaps what kind of privileges or accounts have been allocated or associated with them. But do we have any others? How many others do we even think, we have, or do we know that we have? And I think that's a big factor too, right? Just being honest with ourselves and saying, hey, look, we may not really have our own capabilities to sort of see what's happening in the environment, be able to track that effectively. I think another big thing we've seen or observed is maybe some gaps around risk assessment and risk management. And I would say most organizations are at least somewhat tuned into the key risks that they face, or they work to address that and keep that current as, the business environment changes or as, other conditions change one way or the other. But I think when you bring in the third party factor, what you do is immediately introduce either complete unknowns or some question marks and a little bit of murky gray area, because now it's not just your risk assessment capacity, it's theirs. And it's your risk assessment of them and theirs that starts to really kind of snowball and potentially lead to that realization that we've got blind spots, right? We have a lot of blind spots across the industry. This is not a small thing. This is a very big deal. It's happening more and more. And what I'm finding with a lot of the clients that I talk to is that they've gotten notifications about some of their third parties having breaches or having other incidents, and they had absolutely no idea that number one, some of those partners had some of their data or had access to things that might have been exposed as a part of that. But number two, realizing, when would I have even gotten to that? Who's going to be responsible for that? There's so many factors that are starting to drive this. I think it's a great time for this conversation. Now, funny, I've said this for years. I felt like it was a great time to have this conversation 10 years ago, and here we are, right? It's 2023. We're certainly having the conversation all over again. But in the context of what we're seeing, over the course of even the past year, just to give some very recent examples, some really nasty ones. Gosh, and actually, I don't have a slide on this one, but before we even go any further, the security incident, which sounds suspiciously like ransomware, that shut down, I think it was 5 healthcare organizations in the state of California in the past week. You want to talk about just really big problems. And again, I don't think we've got all the details about that, how they got in, what they did, et cetera. It is not even going to remotely surprise me if the initial point of ingress was coming in through some form of third party or some connectivity that was ultimately stemming from somewhere else. That is no longer a far-fetched proposal when you start trying to figure out root cause. And we know this, you know this, I know this, we know this. So that's one that's going on in the news right now, which, I think we're all kind of waiting to see what some of the outcomes look like. The one from Toyota last year, this one, I'll tell you why I really like this example, not because I wish, ill will on Toyota, of course not, absolutely not. But it's a great example where there's just such an immediate and definitive tie to business impact, right? This is one of those places where you can immediately, map those things together. So they have a major plastic supplier. Obviously, there's plenty of plastic within any major vehicle today. And because of that supplier having a breach, Toyota shut down their operations for a period of time. And if you're talking about, someplace like Toyota, where, look, they know exactly what their production schedule needs to look like for optimal outcomes and outputs and production, shipping, and everything else. All of a sudden, you realize, hey, look, that's a calculated risk decision that was made by leadership within Toyota to say, hey, look, this company Kojima had remote access into their manufacturing plants for whatever types of monitoring or interactions they needed. And we realized very quickly that the only way we were going to at least have a hope of preventing that from, kind of carrying over into our infrastructure is to completely shut it off and potentially shut down all the operations till we at least make sure that we haven't been compromised as well. There's no worse feeling when you realize, oh my gosh, there's an open door to the house, and there happens to be, a burglar prowling around in the neighborhood. Like, okay, wow, that's not good. And so they have, like definitive financial costs, definitive operational impacts that stemmed from that. And this is a, company that would have to report that in, major shareholder documentation. This is everybody's worst nightmare, is being able to say, well, maybe not the worst nightmare. Let's call it the second worst nightmare, right? The worst nightmare, I guess, would be them actually being breached or compromised as a result and having to still shut down. But beyond that, you look at it and say, okay, well, we still had to shut down. Here's the cost that came along with that. I think if I'm looking at this through the lens of, shareholders and stakeholders, and maybe the industry at large, I'm thinking they probably made the right decision, though, right? Take a financial hit to hopefully prevent a much worse one from subsequently happening. So a really interesting example, like I said, definitively tied, to the industry. I mean, there's so many examples of phishing mean, we could just hang out here and talk about it. But I mean, look, going back, tongue in cheek here, to things like the Verizon data breach investigations report, right? So like every year, and I'm sure, again, this is echoed by probably many of you out there as well. Every year I read this thing and I've got my fingers crossed. I've got the hope that this is going to be the year where phishing is not the #1 problem that we face, right? Something else takes the, the mantle. And so we're like, okay, we're getting a handle on the phishing problem, but we're not. We're not getting a handle on the phishing problem. The reality is people are still the weakest link. The phishing folks are getting way better. And there's so many interesting aspects to this one breach that I mentioned here. I mean, again, we could hang out here for an hour and we could probably talk about all the different things that came along with this. But Twilio was, essentially tied into a bunch of other major organizations like Okta and others. It was SMS. It's like SMS was the attack vector, and phishing, vishing. There's all these variations of phishing, but it's all about some sort of manipulative action taken against one or more stakeholders within an organization to try to trick them into giving up information, performing actions, or both. And this led to a huge cascading series of additional compromise and breach disclosure and things that just, again, you kind of have to roll it back up to that initial root cause. And this is just one example of many. There's been tons like this, but this one's, recent enough to where you look at companies like Okta. I mean, hey, I've been saying this for years, and this is not the time for this, right? Again, we could have a long-winded discussion around it, but somebody like Okta, anytime I've got somebody brokering things like my identity to everywhere else, if they get popped, you got a problem, right? They're in the middle of your access to maybe lots of cloud services and other types of things that you're going and trying to get to. And so every one of your end users is maybe going through Okta as the front door before they're off to other places. If the front door is compromised, again, you have problems. So you can really follow this one down at a much deeper level. So another really great example, but again, it just all kind of comes back to phishing in some variation. This one, I think we got a lot of room left to go. Again, I've been having conversations in the industry, and again, right now, we got things like Black Hat and DEF CON going out in Las Vegas, and I guarantee you, there's a lot of this conversation going on right there, right now, about exactly this particular breach. And there's so many question marks just kind of swirling around. But here's the question du jour: how many of you have Microsoft in your third-party ecosystem? Don't all raise your hands at once, right? I mean, look. The fact of the matter is, everybody, you can't escape the vortex that is Microsoft, right? You can try, right? But it's a black hole. You're going to be, sucked into that vortex somewhere, somehow. I mean, whether it's on premises, whether it's in the cloud, probably some of both for a lot of organizations. It's like, all right, how many of, what else are you using for email versus, something like Exchange? There are other email platforms, but it is the #1 email platform, I'm pretty sure, in the world. And so, yeah, whether it's on-prem Exchange and increasingly things like Exchange Online, yep, guess what? They got you. What about Active Directory? What's your directory service? You can, you're going to get dragged kicking and screaming into things like Azure Active Directory, which I think they just renamed because, got to rename stuff just for no reason at all. But, you're there. I'm there. We're all there. Like, nobody escapes the Death Star beam of Azure Active Directory or whatever the heck it's called now. So back to the point, Microsoft being breached like this is really disturbing because it's obviously a calculated attack. There's a lot of signs that point toward nation state actors being involved, and I'm not the person out here to give attribution. Others that are vastly more tied into that are going to do that. And it sounds like it was the Chinese, but, again, I think there's still a lot of runway here in terms of this story. But losing control of a critical signing key and leveraging said signing key to go break into other tenants' infrastructure and read things like their email, especially for government officials, that is pretty bad enough to actually have this come before the US legislature and have them say, hey, we probably need to start having some inquiries into this, right? This is that bad. And there's a lot of sort of, barbs being thrown in Microsoft's direction as to their somewhat negligent security practices or disclosure or both. In fact, the CEO of Tenable very recently just came out and point blank said, you guys are doing a bad job. You're not being transparent. You're not telling us about where your security controls are. And you're certainly not doing a great job of disclosure when you do have problems with all the data that we need. I mean, this was so bad. And again, I'll move on from this and we'll get to the meat of our situation here. But this is so bad that Microsoft was forced to actually, crazy as this sounds, reduce the cost of people being able to get forensic artifacts and logging evidence within their subscription, which, if you want my opinion, not that you did, they should have been giving you that anyway, right? Why in the world are you charging exorbitant sums for things people need to try to clean up their environment and see what the heck is going on? So on that note, let's take a hard left and shift out of here, right? So again, the backdrop of this is what it is. But you may be saying to yourself, like, wow, Dave, okay, thanks for telling us about things we already know. It's important. And it's important simply because it has been one of the absolute biggest drivers in the NIST CSF update process. And so if you go and read, and by the way, if you haven't been involved in the communications and the back and forth and the solicitation for comments and feature requests and specific things, don't stress it, right? I mean, you can go wade through a bunch of people's wish lists and so forth. There's a lot of them, and NIST has done a great job, I think, of actually posting this, right? They've actually gone and done some events in person. They've done some events virtually. They're really, really trying to make sure that they're coming out and saying, hey, look, we want to find out what the heck is going on and what we can do to make this as good as it can be for you, right? I mean, and I love that. I think NIST is doing this right. I really do. But if you go and read through a lot of those comments, and look, I'm not going to lie to you. I have not read all of them, but I have certainly been involved in there. And I have definitely kept up with it since they started this update process quite some time ago. You'll see consistently that a huge number of the participants and people that are making requests and just having discussions are asking for more alignment with third-party risk management all the way across the board. So there's a lot of things that people have been coming to the table and saying, look, I mean, at the risk of just, casting way too wide a net here right at the beginning of this, I would go so far as to say just about every major category has had some reevaluation from the community in light of third-party risk management. It's just that big of a deal. And so I think when this shakes out, and again, we're going to get into some of the specifics here just, in 1 second, I think what we're going to look at is that, hey, CSF 2.0 is going to be a great framework that really helps us better align third-party risk management holistically in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to call out some of the specifics, some of the really interesting things that I've made note of as far as what's happening and sort of how this is progressing. But I think you could probably point to the entire CSF as it's going to come out. And again, I hate making predictions because who knows what could happen or change between now and the beginning of 2024, which is when this is expected to be ratified and solidified into its, call it final form. Admittedly, it'll change again. There will be updates and things, but they're really planning on publishing 2.0 and saying, here it is. We took all this into account. Here you go. In the beginning of next year, right? And somewhere probably in the first quarter of next year is sort of what it's generally slated for. So, okay. Let's give the high level. Let's break it down and say, hey, what's shaking out here? What are the things that are like the big picture things? Okay, a big one. Number one, a totally new section. A new section, you say? Absolutely, because that's what we need. We need a new section. But you know what? I kind of agree with it. We did need a new section because it's an area that deserves a section in its own right, and tangentially sort of made its way across pretty much all the other sections. And so instead of having like little piecemeal elements of all the various other sections that were in there, that included some form of governance, well, let's just suck all those out and put them into their own section. I love that. I think it actually makes a ton of sense. And I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute, but that is definitely a huge development. And sadly, what it also means is that all of those sweet compliance mappings that you've all put together, right? The most beautiful spreadsheets you've ever seen, you're going to have to update those things. That's right. You're going to have to go through all that let's speaking as somebody that's done a ton of that work, right? That's just like, okay, just go to your Zen place or whatever. It's spreadsheet time, my friends. But nobody loves when you got to do a massive update of compliance and controls mapping. So let's just call it out. You know what? Somebody does. And I love those people because they should be the ones that are doing it. So there you go. Big one. Yeah, the governance section is definitely going to be a game changer. Next thing, and this is sort of woven throughout the entirety of the new updates that have come out and that have been published for review. There's a lot more emphasis on alignment with legal and compliance teams. What's interesting to me looking at this as I was going through this and again, reading people's comments and reading the new text and what it all meant, it kind of surprised me that we didn't have that as much in there as we should have. Like all these years, how did we just avoid we don't need to talk to the legal people or compliance, whatever. No, come on, right? They're massive parts of business risk. There's no getting around this. You know this, I know this, we know this. We're just seeing that codified within the language of the CSF in a much more pragmatic and very tactical way. And I think that's right. One of the things I like about the CSF and have always liked about the CSF is its approachability. It's not so overly complicated, at least from a higher level, that you can't sit down with a disparate and wide-ranging group of stakeholders in lots of different areas and say, hey, look, let's talk through this, right? If we're trying to craft a security program and a risk management program that encompasses all the definitive disciplines, that everybody's representative of here, hey, guess what? They need to be in the room. Legal and compliance are massive parts of this and have been forever. Cool, we got that codified. That's another big one. A lot more focus on third-party risk management. I mean, that's why we're here, obviously. So hold that thought. We'll just get into it here in just a second. And one of the real things that came out too, and is still being crafted, so I'll throw this last point out with, again, that caveat that, hey, probably going to see some shifts and changes based on lots of feedback that's coming in. But this whole concept of continuous improvement, a lot more resilience in the protect category, and certainly some of the outcome definitions. In other words, you do this thing, what do you have in terms of expectations as to what it looks like? And actually, one of the ways that somebody mentioned this in one of the comments was, hey, if I've got to look at all these various different controls and different elements of these categories and ask myself, what does good look like, right? Because I think, you've got sort of a sliding scale for any one of those. I mean, some of them are a little more flip the switch. It's a yes, no binary answer, but a lot of them, there's variability across that. But if I have to say, hey, look, we're doing this, but are we doing it well, right? What's a good expected outcome here to say you're doing it right, you're doing it to the spirit of what it was drafted to actually get for you and do for you within your program? That's huge. I mean, I have that question. I mean, look, how many of you have gone out there and read through a framework, right? Like, get the coffee, get yourself in there with your framework, right? Sweet, okay, and looked through some of these things and said, okay, if we're doing some of that, but like the way it's written, am I doing it the right way? How did they kind of intend for it to be written? What was the thought process? Anyway, you get the idea. I've done that, and I'm sure many of you have as well. And so this is sort of the breakdown of the CSF of 2.0 so that you can just see, kind of what it shakes out to look like. And you'll notice a couple things have been renamed a little bit. A couple things have sort of moved around a little bit. For example, down in the detect category, the adverse event analysis, again, more emphasis on continuous monitoring. Some of the things that were in some of these categories have been shifted out a little bit. We definitely have, supply chain risk management is a bigger area of emphasis in the identify category. All good things that I think we can take a look at, but note again, that whole new govern category and section that really brings in a lot of great third-party risk management elements and sort of core concepts that will sort of transcend and come through most of the other areas. And for anybody that's been using the NIST CSF, or at least you're familiar with it, right? All the rest. I mean, identify and protect and detect and respond and recover. I mean, like those are things that we're familiar with already. And not everything is changing. They didn't throw all this out the window and say, no, yeah, we're starting from scratch. I think there were a lot more minor adjustments than major adjustments in some of those areas. But at least, again, we've got a frame of sort of what's out there and what's coming. So let's get into it, right? We're going to spend a couple minutes and I'm going to highlight some of the critical areas and things. And by the way, This is all published, right? This is all stuff that NIST has already documented. It's freely available out on their site. Highly encourage everybody, if you haven't done this, go grab their comment draft and take a look through it and start having the conversation saying, hey, look, if we were having this webinar, even 6 months ago, so this was actually published back in April, so it's been around for a little bit, right? We've seen some of this getting even more conversation and dialogue going on. But if we were doing this even 6 months ago, I might have said, hey, don't stress this yet. Give it a little bit more time to breathe before you start looking at this and saying, yes, this is likely to stay as is, once it's, ultimately published in its final form. I'm feeling like we're probably pretty close. I think that a lot of the things that we're going to cover right now are unlikely to change dramatically. I think you're probably going to see some tweaks here and there in terms of wording and a couple other things, but I don't think that we're going to see massive changes for a lot of this stuff going forward. So, okay, first things first, we're in governance, right? So notice the GV as sort of the the declarative element of categorical area we're in. We're talking about risk management strategy, and you'll note that this was formerly just ID risk management strategy. So we took it out of the identifier and moved it into its own governance place. But you'll notice that we're really calling out cybersecurity supply chain risk management and agreed to by organizational stakeholders. Not really anything that different other than some of the wording. So the only big change that's happened here is we moved it out of ID over into governance. Not a big deal. This one shouldn't be a difficult one to sort of just extrapolate out into the new framework model. Now you get down to some of these other ones. We got some new mojo going on, right? So we've got RM5 and RM6 within the governance category. And so I think these are some of the most important additions to the framework right here up front, because what we're talking about is strategic direction and accountability and responsibility to basically say, hey, look, somebody in the organization has to own this program. Somebody needs to be the stakeholder responsible or the team responsible for administering, maintaining, and aligning with third-party risk management. We've got to do it. In other words, what are we accepting? What are we unwilling to accept? What do we have in terms of contracts? All of that stuff needs to be assigned and be an actual, defined and assigned set of job functions. And again, it's one of those classic places you get here and go, how did we not have that in there before? I don't know, you tell me, but it is there now. And so I do think that those are going to be important, because if you're trying to meet the letter of the standard, then you're going to have that. It's going to need to be a determined and assigned function within the organization with people that are actually responsible for it day to day. Moving into some of the next ones, again, these are things that did not exist in the previous version. We got lines of communication, including supply chain risks. That sounds a little obvious, doesn't it? Oh, well, yeah, of course you need a comms plan and you need some, maybe workflows and playbooks and, communication strategies. You'd be amazed how many organizations don't have that well defined in a lot of ways. In fact, one of the things I consistently hear from SOC teams that I work with, right? People down in the trenches in the weeds is, one of the things they lose a ton of time on is, trying to find the right people to help them get stuff done during an incident. Same thing applies to third-party risk management. Let's not be those folks, right? Let's make sure that we've got the right lines of communication, that they're established, that we know who to reach out to, they know who to reach out to. It's a two-way street. The next one, the same policies used internally or applied to suppliers. I think that's probably one of the biggest changes to come into this entire thing. All right, just let that one sink in for a minute. And one of the things I'll say here, I think we're going to need a little more clarification on this. That one still feels a little nebulous-y to me. I don't know. I'd definitely be interested in some, some commentary or questions around that one, because I looked at this like, hey, what does that mean? Policies, right? Like, hey, this word, I do not think it means what you think it means. Okay, maybe we're going to need a little clarity as to what policy means, because it's like, hey, wait a minute. I can't take all of my highly subjective policies that relate to my company or my organization or my agency and hand them off to a company that makes pencils for us and say, yep, you got to meet every single one of these. That feels a little heavy-handed. So I'm actually, and you can, mark this one, maybe I'll be right about it. We'll see. But this one might get a little bit more clarity with regard to language as we go through the next several months. Now we get into the identify category. And so these are just some things that, again, I'm kind of calling out. External information systems are cataloged. That's what it used to say. Now it's a little broader. Inventories of external assets and suppliers. Okay. I think we just broadened it a little bit, and necessarily so, to encompass a bit more with regards to third parties. And I think this next one, sensitive data and corresponding metadata, also inventoried and tracked. That didn't exist before, which again is like, how in the world did we not have like something that said, yeah, you should, I don't know, sounds crazy, but kind of should know where your sensitive data is. I mean, good idea. I'm for it. I think all of us in security are probably for it as well. But I love the idea that it's been, again, sort of codified here within the next framework. Now you'll notice a couple here at the bottom. I'm not going to really say much more about them, but you'll notice those dropped. There's a bunch of those throughout because they all got moved into the new governance category. Now, this is a big one. Bum, bum, bum. It's the supply chain risk management section. And so there's really only a handful of things to call out here. Obviously it looks like a lot, but we had this to some degree before, right? This is not something that was just not existent before. We had supply chain risk management in this category. It's actually been tuned down a little bit. And the reason is because we took a bunch of them and moved them out into the governance part or into another place where they kind of fit a little bit better. Right. So for instance, response and recovery planning, that kind of went to a different place. The first two, one moved to governance. Again, another moved off to like third-party risk assessments, supply chain risk assessments. There's like different pieces of this. But what we did see was, again, I think a little bit more clarity in terms of some of the wording. And then the next thing we saw here was a new one. And I think this is sorely needed. And not just a framework, but in organizations and their risk management, is supplier termination and transition processes with security in there. In other words, it's not just, hey, we're done with the contract, and maybe this is SLAs or meeting very particular business requirements. No. There absolutely needs to be security in the mix. And the way I read this a little bit, and again, I'm always curious to hear if anybody agrees or disagrees with me. I don't know if any of us are right yet. A little bit of that, to me, if I'm looking at this from a security perspective, I'm saying, hey, are we including security considerations? I mean, it's sort of twofold. Number one, hey, we know we're going to terminate a business relationship, and we need to have some security, conversations and requirements as a part of the termination. Yes, that's a piece of this. But I sort of read into this a little bit to say, hey, wait a minute, is security failure or lack of security in some regard enough to warrant a termination and transition? And do we have very clear sort of breakouts of exactly what those requirements and things are? I'm like, yeah, I think so. I think it's a couple of different things. Again, I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit of sort of, massaging the language here and potentially making some changes to that. And I saw a comment that just came in, the key takeaway, organizations need to hold their partners up to the same security guidelines. Quinn, I totally agree with you. I think 100%. There's absolutely no question that some of these things are basically, hey, you're going to need to meet the same standard of due care that we do, right? I mean, everybody's a third party to somebody. This next one here is, again, I think another kind of classic and simple example. Supply chain security practices are integrated and performance is monitored throughout the technology, product, and service lifecycle. In other words, we're paying attention. We're paying attention to where those third parties are, and we're looking at their security practices, not only like technologically in-house, but also in terms of, potentially what they're doing in their own environments. And so this one, again, is of course trying to, obviously facilitate things like protection. We move off into a little bit of discussion around, things like continuous monitoring. And what we really did here was just sort of combine a couple of different things. I don't think that this one's, wholly that much different in terms of what we had in the past. We just consolidated two into one, right? So CM6 and CM7 just became CM6. for external service providers. And we're saying, hey, yeah, we're absolutely paying attention to them from a security perspective. So not a big change, it's a change nonetheless. One of the other things that I really encourage everybody to go out and check out within this new proposed framework, it's something that they haven't really formally kind of published a lot of yet. So a lot of speculative, kind of conversations being had right now. But to be honest, this is one of the things I'm most eager to see. And it's definitive, actual supply chain risk management outcomes. And they've even got a moniker for this, right? CSCRM. And that's what they plan on applying label-wise to these outcomes. And we just haven't seen a lot of this published quite yet. It's coming. And I will tell you, at least again, from the feedback that I was reading through, everybody wants this. Absolutely everybody wants this, because there's so much ambiguity in people's third-party and supply chain risk management that it'd be great to have some guideposts to sort of say, hey, look, again, what does good look like within a third-party risk management model with tooling and reporting and, sort of the cyclical evaluation of providers and contracts and security capabilities. The era of, hey, let's give them a short, questionnaire and chalk it up and put it in a folder like that. I think those are moving away, right? I think we need more, and I think we need more on a much more continuous basis. And then, of course, you see that specific sort of risk, legal, and compliance alignment that's still being fleshed out. And so this is very much intended to go on through the rest of this year. And so we got some time. Again, if you've got some thoughts on this, you've got some very specific things that you want or some opinions, I would absolutely say this is a place to go. And I just saw the other comment from Quinn around like 853 and FedRAMP. Everybody's getting in on this, the cybersecurity supply chain factors, because it's woven into everything, right? I mean, there's no question around this. I think we have to take that into account, right? So really interesting stuff. And I think we're certainly going to be better off for having better guidance and more general industry consensus around the language and the framework overall. Even again, if this is not your primary framework, it's a great one as a backdrop for a whole lot of other things. So, hey, look, all right, risk reviews. We need to be thinking about controls. We need to be thinking about the frequency of security reviews. We need remediation. We need arbitration processes for handling these kinds of things. And so what my hope is that, this works both ways. So obviously here, my expectation is that, yeah, chances are, there's going to be some really interesting things that the security side of this, you, me, risk management, all of us, whether we're auditing, whatever everybody's job roles are, we're looking at this through the lens of, hey, I can use this as, sort of a backdrop for my own program. And that's great. But the flip side is your suppliers are going to see this too. And I would love a groundswell of, I hate to use the word pressure. Pressure feels kind of off to me. Yeah, I think you know what I mean. I don't like that idea that people are being forced or, painted into a corner. But I think we need more of this. I mean, I think, there's been so much lax security across so many organizations for so long that, look, it's time to get your act together. And I think if, hey, we start to see a definitive drop in business or, relationships as a result of some of this, I think that's what's going to help push this in the right direction. And I just saw the comment come in, requiring another organization to follow an internal policy could cause legal issues. Yeah, I think it's a fair point, right? And that's why I said, we'll just see how that one shakes out. I don't know. You don't know. That one might be prone to a little bit better clarification wording wise as this progresses. The question came in from LA: will SBOMs be included in the CSCRM? I hope so, right? I would love to see a software bill of materials represented here. And in fact, I had another webcast with Prevalent that we talked about some of this stuff not that long ago. So I'm quite sure, pointing at the Prevalent team, that this is archived somewhere on their site if anybody's interested in that. But I think I got pretty ranty on that one. I think I had a pretty solid soapbox in my SBOM presentation. So yes, I'm very much hoping so, Ellie, but we don't 100% know yet. Again, that's still sort of up in the air. And the question just came in from Antonio: are supply chain risk management and third-party risk management interchangeable phrases? I think for the purposes of this conversation, probably so. There's some sort of minutiae that you could probably peel off with either one, but for the purposes, I mean, your supply chain is a third party, right? So I think if we were getting a little more specific, like software supply chain or something, then yeah, I think it would probably be different. But generically and holistically, yes, I think that's a fair approximation. So, all right, basically, here we are. Make sure you've got things like risk rankings. This is still something that's absolutely coming up and getting more mature in the industry, keeping track of some of these things. Again, this is not new. This is not something that should probably surprise anybody out here. But what I think, is going to be good is this is now going to become much more formalized in a lot of people's organizations as a result of things like 2.0. So, hey, somebody's going to have to be in charge of this. If you don't have some, sort of holistic risk ranking model and, things like, like posture assessment mechanisms and tools, you have things like reputation rankings, you're going to need them, right? And especially if you have a large ecosystem of third parties, I think that's absolutely where we're going to have to get to. And it all starts with a thorough review, with vendor reviews and vendor analysis, looking at contract terms. I know a lot of security teams that have absolutely no idea about a lot of the contract terms that are in things with their even leading suppliers. I mean, probably don't have enough time to do this kind of stuff, but that is exactly the point. We need to find the time. We need people that are dedicated to this. We need more frequent cadence of vendor reviews and third-party reviews. And ultimately, again, we're sort of wrapping this and putting a bow on it in the context of, the NIST CSF 2.0. But, does anybody think that this is bad, right? Or that these are bad directional changes that are being made? I doubt it. I certainly don't. This feels like progress. I'm really feeling pretty good and seeing that, set of outcomes get developed, better alignment with legal and compliance and risk, real definitive, hey, you need this as a core function of your risk management platform and framework. And again, lots of different ways that we could potentially do this stuff. So, okay, that is me. And now I'm going to hand it over. So Scott, let me stop sharing here and take it away, my friend.
Thanks very much, Dave. I appreciate it. Still, I'm seeing your desktop though.
Okay, let me stop my share and okay, there we go.
There we go. Thank you, sir. All right. Cool. Just quick check. You guys can see my screen okay. Awesome. Thumbs up from Dave. Thanks. Thanks so much, Dave. Thanks, folks, for sticking around throughout the rest of our webinar today. Super insightful, as always, from Dave on a very important and timely topic for today. I literally just saw yesterday that NIST published, their draft CSF guidance, that's kind of forthcoming. It was dated yesterday. So, it's imminent. Dave really walked through quite a bit of in quite a bit of detail, kind of what's coming, what to look for. What you'll see from Prevalent going forward is we will then start to adapt that new framework and then update our existing NIST CSF content in our platform, because we have a dedicated questionnaire set for the NIST CSF. I think it's currently on 1.1, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll update it to 2.0 and include this new question structure. And like Dave mentioned a few minutes ago about how complex it is to map these things together, there are very special people, me one of them, who likes to sit with spreadsheets and just do individual mappings between controls, between these things. And, we're going to do that on your behalf, frankly. So, in the platform, that NIST CSF questionnaire will have controls that auto map to 853, 800, 171, and 161. And then other critical controls as well. So I know that NIST does publish that set of overlapping controls guidance in the chart or the table in the appendix. We operationalize that, put it in the database, enable the auto mapping, so that you have to, so if you have to kind of map between different regulations or frameworks, that work is already done for you. And then that reporting and control validation stuff can happen much more simply on your end. So watch for that coming from Prevalent. As soon as that 2.0 gets released officially, we'll be able to go from there. From a capability perspective, it's more than just NIST for us. We have more than 200 assessment templates in our platform, all the different flavors of NIST, ISO, SOC 2, HISAC, our own assessment, and hundreds more that you can leverage to assess your third-party suppliers, vendors, partners, and others, to assess their security controls and other types of third-party risks. Bring it all together into a single risk register, if you will, raise risks, report on it, and then suggest remediations to close off to an acceptable level of risk to your organization. Our approach to third-party risk is to do three things for you. Number one is help you get the data you need to make better decisions, risk visibility into where the risks are, who your risky vendors are, and then to push through remediations that make sense for everybody. Second, to increase team efficiency and knock down the silos that tend to kind of grow up naturally in organizations between the security team and the operations team and the risk team and the procurement team, so that you guys are all looking for risk or at risk using a single source of the truth. And then finally, give you the ability to evolve and scale your program over time. We see risk across every stage of a third-party vendor and supplier lifecycle, every stage of it. And we deliver capabilities because we understand those challenges at every one of those stages, and I won't belabor this, but at the end of the day, again, our objective is to help you simplify and speed up onboarding with the single source of the truth, single process, streamline the risk assessment process, and then unify your teams across the life cycle. And kind of beyond scope from what our discussion is today, we do this for not only cybersecurity risks, but also business and operational risks, financial, ESG, reputational compliance risks as well. And every one of these bullet points, and this is only a representative sample, has either a definitive assessment in the platform or data that we stream in from an outside third-party risk monitoring service to then enable you to correlate your assessment findings against this continuous monitoring stuff. We deliver all of this in a combination of three things. Number one is our experts that help do the hard work of third-party risk on your behalf if you want to outsource for managed services. Give you a huge repository of data that makes sense and is contextualized and reported in a way that helps you make good decisions. And then we house it in a platform that enables better workflow management and automation. Look, at the end of the day, our objective is to help your third-party risk organization be smarter in its approach to third-party risk, unify your teams, and then give you the prescriptive guidance and intelligence to help you make sound risk-based decisions with regard to those third parties. I mentioned the fact that we have a CSF assessment in our platform now, and that we will update it to the 2.0 requirements when that's finally published. But we also have published a NIST third-party risk management checklist, which you are free to download. We'll follow up with the recording and the presentation tomorrow with a link to this for you to download the paper as well. But what we've gone through, or what we've done is we've gone through 853, 161, and the CSF, the existing version of the CSF, and we've extracted all of the key supply chain risk management, third-party risk management, vendor, whatever risk management controls and highlights or whatever, and then we've mapped that into a table along with some of the overlappings, as I mentioned earlier, and then identified some third-party risk best practices or capabilities to make sure that either you or your vendors have in place to help meet that particular control requirement or sub-requirement in that framework. We've done a lot of the hard work for you. It's a 30-page document. It's not an easy read. I put it together so I know how painful it was. But it's a great resource for you to get a good landscape view of those three NIST-specific regulations, or frameworks rather, and what you need to do to kind of optimize that for your organization. So with that, that's all I wanted to share with you today. But I'll kind of turn it over to Melissa. We can open it back up for questions if you guys still have questions.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Scott. Now would be a really good time if you do have any questions, throw them in the Q&A box. We've gotten a handful already that Dave kind of chipped away at. And I will launch our second poll. You'll see it pop up on your screen. There you go. Basically, we will follow up with you regarding any TPRM projects. I know now's the time where people are planning for Q1 of 2024. Are you looking to establish or augment what you've got going on in your TPRM program? Maybe you're still stuck in spreadsheet jail, and please be honest, because like I said, we do follow up with you. But yeah, I mean, lots of really good feedback. I know we do have one question open at this time, and Dave, I'm not sure if you can see it on your end, from Jose. Do you see it?
Yeah, let's see. So this is more of a comment, I think, from Jose, but it deserves calling out about the governance saying, hey, look, this needs clarity because of the nature of trying to basically force or foist your internal policies on somebody else. Definitely needs some clarification. Definitely needs some clarification, and I think we will get some, because I think that's going to be a very common thread. You can't just have some, sort of catch-all that says, hey, you got to do what I'm doing. It doesn't wash. Every organization is different. So thanks for that, Jose. And I agree. I mean, I think we're going to see a lot more discussion probably on that throughout the remainder of the year. So I see there's a question here from Walt. Thoughts on Move It and PBI. I mean, this is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, how many bugs can you have in a short period of time? Might be a better way to phrase that. But it's what you're talking about is a third party that's in use by thousands of organizations, where people are able to publicly access file transfer mechanisms and things. And if you've got massive flaws in that, whatever files are being transferred or whatever data is being transited through that mechanism, hypothetically is something that could cause lots of problems. And in fact, I think we're going to see some stuff shake out of exactly that. We've got the question, how can this align with ISO? I think that's probably more along some of the things that Scott was talking about. I mean, in terms of alignment with any framework, there's going to have to be some mapping between those two. So that's TBD. I think we're going to see some of those things flesh out after we get a finalized version of it. To be fair. I'll throw this last one that came in. Does this apply for critical infrastructure, IT, and OT both, or different checklists? Well, I think this is probably the checklist that we're talking about from the prevalent team. So I will let Scott maybe chime in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, a critical perspective, I think, is 171 is the NIST requirement specifically related to critical. So there is the overlap and the mapping of controls between the different frameworks. So yeah, CSF is more generalized, but I think it's 171, if I'm not mistaken, is the one that's more attuned to critical.
Excellent. I see an anonymous question that came in. The new CSF, in my opinion, what's the best way to get every department's input on each topic? Long face-to-face meetings, a shared Excel spreadsheet, lots of remote workers and a lot of department officers. Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I mean, it's a bigger one than I can probably answer in a soundbite right here. And it's somewhat subjective because every organization is a little bit different. But I mean, first off, there needs to be acknowledgement that, everybody needs to chip in and be a part of this. And some of that's going to be, I think, aided by the new governance section that kind of calls them out and says, hey, look, there needs to be better alignment. There needs to be more involvement. And ultimately, somebody's got to shepherd the program along. So I think we're going to see some things that might help you. But ultimately, yeah, forcing people into long meetings, nobody loves that. But I think there needs to be maybe some tabletops or some sort of collaborative, like regular meetings and things scheduled that gets those right stakeholders in place and gets everybody's input. Because the worst thing is to develop a program and not have the input in the first place, right? And I think we're at the very end here. I'll just throw out one quick answer to Sherry Kelly on the new version in AI risk. Don't know. Haven't seen anything really about that, but TBD.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dave, for answering all those questions at rapid fire speed. Thanks everyone for asking them. And if you want to stay in that TPRM loop with us, feel free to add us on LinkedIn. And